Hi. Okay, think I can speak for both Lynn and I. We were not expecting this many people, but welcome. Good morning. Glad you all are here. We're going to talk about medical device cybersecurity fundamentals. So really what goes into medical device security programs, what are really your cornerstones of these programs, what's the approach, and really how do you start, right? And so I know this has been covered many times. Hopefully what you'll take away from our presentation are some actual tangible steps to just get started somewhere on your medical device security journey. All right, I think I have to use the clicker. All right, about your presenters, we'll introduce ourselves real quick. So my name is Jessica Pitterka. I'm the Clinical Asset Defense Engineer at HonorHealth. I've been building medical device security programs for about the last 10 years, and I have a master's degree now in cybersecurity and information assurance as well. Lynn? Yeah.
All right, so I'm Lynn, I'm the director for HonorHealth, which encompasses both Biomed and HCM, cybersecurity, asset recovery, a lot of different branches that fall under HCM. I will say that I bring a kind of a unique perspective because I was a flight nurse originally. So I've been on both sides of the equipment, right? As a user and as a repairer. And so I think that I'm passionate really about cybersecurity because patient information is probably the most sought after information out there on the dark web, whatever you want to call it. And so the more that we can do to protect that, our patients, our information for our patients is safer, and therefore will be a trusted partner, essentially. So that's it.
All right, let's look at the intro to medical device security. So what is medical device security? Really, when you boil it down, it comes to the practices and the processes, the technology that we use to protect clinical equipment, medical devices, patients, right? Really from cyber threats. And a lot of times it's not an if something happens, right? As in a cyber world, it's not if, it's when, and how do we limit that risk to our patients, to our organization. So really medical device security comes down to managing that risk. You manage the likelihood of something happening and the impact of something happening. We are, likelihood and impact, so cyber incidents especially. There have been a lot of breaches just recently even where, you know, we get that message from our CISO at 6:30 in the morning saying, how many pieces of equipment do we have and what's connected, and, you know, really trying to figure out the next steps. So part of that, of course, is going to be your asset management, knowing what equipment do you have, what talks to what, and this is all part of your medical device security program. You're going to have to identify where are all your tentacles, right? What does your equipment talk to? Does it talk to your EMR, your PACS? Does it talk outside? What kind of communication? Does it talk to the internet, or does it just talk internally? And does it talk to other peer devices next to it? Printers, workstations? You know, the devices are getting more and more connected. And while we're trying to really rein it in, limit that connectivity to other systems, to users, we're trying to manage that access. We also need to look at usability of the device, right? If we're applying all the controls that we can to make this equipment secure, is it still usable for the clinician? Can they still do what they need to do with this piece of equipment? We can walk away at the end of the day and say, it's secure, we're good, but the clinician can't use the equipment, right? So there's really that fine balance of safety, usability. And then, of course, medical device security, it spans many different pillars. We'll cover those pillars here in a minute. One of them, vulnerability management, we hear all the time. There's a vulnerability on a medical device, or there's a recall on a medical device. You need to do something about it. What that something is at the time is most of the time not known, but we'll get there. Change management is a big part of medical device security, and then also network segmentation.
And just to add to that real quick, so Jessica brought this point up, like you have a patient that has had a stroke or is a STEMI or something. Do you want to have a 27 character password to get into that device when seconds matter, right? And so I think that's where we try to balance with what is going to keep most people out but allow our clinicians to do their job too. So go ahead.
So why does it matter? Why does medical device security matter? It's relatively new, right? I said I've been doing this for 10 years. It really started, I want to say, in healthcare when WannaCry came out. Everybody who was there 10 years ago when WannaCry came out was scrambling because IoT solutions weren't a thing. We didn't know what was connected. We didn't know what had SMB1 enabled. We just really didn't know at the time. We had an inventory of our assets. We didn't know what operating system was on there. So why does it matter? It's because there's a direct impact on patient safety. So operations is impacted when your device goes down. Do you have to divert, right? Because now all of a sudden everything's offline. So this is why it matters. Your patient, right? The patient that's on the table, I was in a situation where there's a patient on a CT table and all of a sudden everything stopped working. So how long are you going to let that patient lay there, right? It's one of those things where you really need to have an inventory. You need to know how everything is connected and how it operates front to back. And connected devices are everywhere. So we have seen devices connected that by no means should be connected to the network. There's devices floating out there that are 30 years old, right? And somehow they're connected to the network, right? We have XP, legacy systems. All of those pose an increased risk. In addition to that, there's that increased cyber risk right now to healthcare organizations in particular, because hospitals are oftentimes a target, right? They're focused on protecting patient safety, protecting that patient information, but that's also very valuable information for attackers to gain, right? And are hospitals going to pay the ransom or not to protect their patient information, right? Things to consider.
Just to add to that too, it's not, cybersecurity is very important, but for example, Jen's in the back of the room there, we had a fiber cut for one of our hospitals. No patient monitoring anymore. Nothing that needed to be on the network could be on the network. So what's plan B, right? And so typically they'll rope in Biomed to say like, how do we get this back, right? Well, what's Biomed gonna do? Like run fiber real quick? So I think that's important, not just the threat of it, but how do we keep patient safety via connected devices in general too? Yeah.
Okay, so the challenge, we kind of touched on this a little bit. So balancing the clinical needs with the security needs, right? That's a big challenge for us in medical device security. Accessibility to the device versus the confidentiality. How much do I want to lock it down with a 20 character password on a CT? Doesn't make sense. You have to do a stroke rule out. Who has time to type in that many characters, get them wrong? You know, there's frustration at the other end of the technician. So that's one thing. Can we control access to the device in another way? Door badges, right? Everyone badges into their CT room. You can't get in any other way. That's, for example, something you can do rather than having that long password on your CT. Another challenge that we look at is oftentimes the communication gap. So biomeds, right? We don't always speak the same language as IT or the clinical staff, right? We call things different things. Vendors also have their own little language sometimes when it comes to things. For any vendors, we love you, but there is a communication gap, right? We have to acknowledge that. So Tucker actually is going to have a session here. Tucker's over there. He's going to have a session later today to talk about IT and HTM and what that communication looks like to bridge that gap in a little bit. Legacy systems. So we know in healthcare, we have systems, like I said earlier, that are old legacy systems, outdated operating systems. Some are running XP, some are running Windows 7. Impossible to secure unless we're applying mitigating controls because we can't patch these systems. Now the question comes up, why don't we just replace them? Okay, let's replace $1 million piece of equipment, right? It's not that easy. You have to come up with the funds. So high replacement cost makes, and the devices are just very difficult to secure. And a lot of times what we also see is that there's vendor controlled devices or vendor hardware. So the vendors come in and they're saying, you want to use our piece of equipment, fine, here you go. It's gonna be, here's your computer. It's $75,000 for the software on this computer, but you have to use our computer. You cannot use your own device because that's how it was validated by the FDA. Okay, so the FDA always comes in those kind of situations. For an organization, controlling those devices is extremely difficult because we can't apply our own security to those devices. A lot of times the vendor then also has to come in to patch those systems. So something to keep in mind. If you have the choice to use a vendor device versus your own standard for the organization, definitely go with that, with your own standard. There's resistance, like I mentioned before. Can we put an antivirus on the device? Can we scan the device? A lot of times the vendors will tell us no, and they cite the FDA. They say that's not how it was validated, or it was only validated with certain antivirus. But that's not what we're using. So what are we now going to do? Purchase different antivirus? Or do we assume the risk as soon as we purchase the piece of equipment? Do we as an organization assume the risk for then saying, we're putting our antivirus on, we acknowledge you haven't tested it, but it's probably going to be fine. Maybe it's not, right? That's something that you can also then test when the vendor comes in, brings you the piece of equipment before you deploy it. Your intake, your initial inspection, you can test the equipment with that antivirus on it, for example. Scan it, run a vulnerability scan, right? That's the perfect time. The vendors tell you, we can't scan the equipment, but that perhaps is your perfect time. Test it, push everything you can to this device at that time to see what's going to break it. And then maybe don't buy it if it does break. All right, limited patching ability. A lot of medical devices, the vendors will say, either we can't patch, we as an organization can't patch them, a vendor has to come out to patch them, they're not patchable at all, or they don't need to be patched because they're not connected to the network. But maybe perhaps in some cases they could be connected to the network, right? So limited patching ability is really a big challenge for us. Only some of the patches have to be validated. Some vendors say, go ahead and put any patch in there on the device, it's fine. So you really have to work with your vendors there and come up with a good way to track that. If you track your patches and the ability of patching. Again, these are conversations you need to have with the vendor before you purchase the equipment, right? When you're talking in the initial phases, you should already know what your ability is to patch the equipment. Now, if you have the equipment already in-house, it looks a little bit different, right? Maybe there's compensating controls that we then apply if we can't patch. And integrations. Integrations is such a big headache for all of us because the equipment now needs to talk to PACS, needs to talk to EHR and everything else. And then the physician wants to sit at home and look at the device, and you know, everyone has their own specific needs. So these, I would say, a lot of challenges, but these are the main challenges for medical device security.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so if you think about it, we're on Windows 11 now. There's 3 upgrades that went through between the time the FDA approved old device, right? And so if you think about it, they're even on 10-year cycles. You only have 5 years before you get the next version of Windows, right? So as you're buying this equipment kind of on the end of the spectrum of when they're selling it, you might only have 2 years, right? And so Mark's in the front here. There was one that a purchase that he stopped because we were buying a Windows 10 set of devices, right? Well, we were already on Windows 11, so that was a no-go for us. We had to go back to the vendor and be like, well, if you're not validated, then we're going to go somewhere else, right, to get this particular technology. So it really being in on the front end of it to stop sort of the bleed, if you will, of trying to have to manipulate in the field what you could have stopped in the beginning. So that's kind of, as leaders, what we're trying to do as well to stop the issue of having to do stuff later on.
Did the OEM sell that same model with the upgraded?
To Mark Yoder, they did. Yep, sure did.
Okay, we're going to talk about the pillars. These are really the foundations of a medical device security program. And there's more than these 5 pillars that we'll present, but since we're talking about fundamentals, this is what I think that medical device security should really focus on, at least in the beginning. So we have asset management. We discussed having the need for an accurate inventory. Risk management, how do you manage that risk, right? Risk from before the device enters your organization, and risk when the device is there and there's vulnerabilities. How do you prioritize that risk? You also have change management. So any kind of change we're making to a device, how is that tracked across the organization? So we can go back if something breaks, how do we go back and figure out what it was that did break it and what went well? So next time we know, what to do. Network segmentation. So network segmentation is a huge undertaking. I do want to acknowledge that, but there's small steps that we can take to make things better on our network. And then we also have vulnerability management and patch management as a subsection of vulnerability management. We patch in response to vulnerabilities or to prevent, things from going sideways. Okay, implementation roadmap. We're trying to keep this pretty simple. And so first, let's talk about your first step, visibility. Visibility, you need to see what's out there. You need to, and this goes across all the different pillars we discussed, right? Visibility into your network, visibility into what changes you're doing right now, what your asset looks like, patching and vulnerability. So visibility is first. Then once you have that visibility, you're going to move to your next phase, right? Risk reduction. You're going to try to reduce that risk. What is my highest risk? What are the highest risk assets? How do I reduce that risk? From there, you move into operationalizing. So now I've worked on, okay, I got my high risk things taken care of. How do I operationalize this? You might be creating SOPs at this point, rolling it out across more modalities. Maybe you just start with one hospital or one department and you reduce the risk and then expand from there, you operationalize. And then your last step will really be optimizing. This is like your 5-star program. You're really optimizing. You have the foundation all built out and you're just building based on that.
Agree. And even something like for visibility, IV pumps, right? In every single hospital and across the network, what are we going to do with them? After the 4th vulnerability that comes out that they can't remediate, the vendor just throws their hands up and says, well, yeah, it's just a vulnerability, right? So what are we going to do for that? We're going to take them all and they're not going to be able to talk to anything else. They're going to cordon off. They can go outside and in this little cubby hole, but then that's it. So just kind of stratifying where's the bang for your buck, right? So then if you do IV pumps, you're thousands and thousands of devices safer, right? And so just kind of starting it that way, I think is a good way too.
Yeah, and I think this is probably one of the most important things. We want you to start simple. Start somewhere, start simple, build that momentum over time and mature your program. You can't do everything all at once. It's impossible. I mean, you can have the biggest team. It's just not possible. You got to start somewhere, find where you're going to start, prioritize that risk, and then work your way from left to right. This right here is an example of what I want to call a maturity model. This is just a couple items thrown at you here so you can see what that growth looks like, that phased approach in some of these categories. I can't walk over there, but if you want to talk a little bit more about this.
Yeah. So basically, if as an organization, you're going to have to say, how safe are we each year? How are we moving the ball forward? So looking at that maturity model, where are the gaps? And is it because we don't even know what our inventory is we can't see our connected devices? Where can we start by doing that? And I think that's how we go across. And there are governmental organizations, just like they control how nurses sit for the bar and how doctors get their medical license. They control how we're safe as far as cybersecurity. So there's always a regulatory component to it. And you know what? Guess what? That affects how we get reimbursed from Medicare, how we get reimbursed from Medicaid, how we get commercial payers to reimburse us. So it really impacts several different things. Even though you think it's like, okay, no one stole our data today, it's not just that. There's a lot of things that go into that.
Yeah. And not just how much we get reimbursed, but also how much do we pay? Because we have to pay cyber insurance as well, right? So how well you're doing in these categories will directly impact how much you're paying another company to insure you in case of a cyber risk. So those are all things. If you have any questions about this or doing an initial assessment, your CISO probably has some great resources on his team. There are assessments that the information security team goes through every single year, and Biomed is one of those areas that gets scored. So they're open that door, have that conversation, and ask, you know, where are we ranking right now, and then identify those areas that you can grow in. Okay, we're going to jump into our first pillar, asset management, and what we're trying to do throughout this whole presentation is, as we're discussing these pillars, give you different paths. So I said at the beginning of the presentation, we would like you to walk away with actual tangible steps that you can take to start a medical device security program. So there will be most likely 2 paths for those of you that already have an IoT solution deployed, and then those of you that don't and have to kind of go the manual route in getting some of these things done.
So asset management details. We are fortunate enough to have an IoT solution where we can see the traffic going between sites and between devices. So what we do with that is that's coming straight from the manufacturer. It's got a serial number, it's got the MAC address, it's got all of these things that are valuable. What version of software is it on? Because when you have a recall, it could be for only a certain version of software. And so you got to kind of figure out where you're at. So we do monitor that traffic, and we were able to create a bridge between that traffic and our CMMS. So we have the manual, you know, our technicians are loading that information, but we're also gathering it. So we're triangulating it all along to say, is it accurate? If it's not, where are we missing on this? So I won't read the slide to you, but just to kind of go through, this also helps us improve our inventory accuracy, right? So is this network seeing something that, you know, Nurse Betty brought in and we don't even know exists, that's over here in, you know, endoscopy or something. So as we're triangulating that, we're getting to a source of truth, and we're also getting safer because we're acknowledging that it's out there. You know, how can we lock it down, not let it talk, all of those things. So just the added benefit too, and lots of the shops have used this, is AP mapping. Where's the last place we saw that device? Okay, that's a starting point to say, let me go look there, because it's going to be somewhere in another department, you know, 2 days from now. So we were successful in doing that when you don't have like an RTLS or an actual location tracking system for apps.
Yeah. And for those of you that joined Ben's presentation earlier on asset management too, he emphasized the importance of knowing what devices are offline, are not there, or can't be located that have PHI on them, right? So for us as an organization, when we started measuring this and we started looking at the devices, this was years ago, there were 600 of them where we were like, okay, but that it's not that they were missing, it was that the asset management portion wasn't there, right? So there were changes in our CMMS system at the time. So a lot of that is attributed to, you know, just cutting over systems and just not having all that information. But now today, our last report, we had 5 devices that had PHI that haven't been connected to a network in 60 days. Doesn't mean that they've left our organization, right? They could be in Nurse Betty's closet for all I know, right? We've seen infusion pumps in a ceiling in some hospitals. They're stashed away, right? Like people get creative with hiding their equipment. So know what equipment you have coming onto your network, but also know what hasn't been reporting on the network and hasn't talked to. And so it's a big part of asset management. Okay, pillar 1, asset management. We're going to go into it. Asset management is really about inventory visibility. What do you have, especially connected to your network, as far as assets? How do you achieve it, right? How do you find out what's connected to your network? So you have 2 paths. You have the automated data collection and you have the manual data collection. So for automated data collection, you deploy an IoT solution that sits on your network. It does passive discovery. It has no interference with your medical devices. It just sits there, listens to the chatter of the devices on the network, and it tells you what kind of device it is. Most cases, it'll tell you the serial number, definitely the MAC address, IP address. Depending on how you have it mapped, it can tell you the access points. So the next time you go out and you're looking for that infusion pump, oh, it's 4th floor or 4th floor over in that corner, you know exactly where to find it. So deploy that IoT solution. set up that bidirectional integration between your CMMS or CMDB with your IoT solution. So what that means, what Lynn touched on earlier, is if my technician updates the CMMS, that information feeds into my IoT solution, and vice versa. If that equipment moves and it's now no longer on the 4th floor, but it's, I don't know, on the 2nd floor, it updates in your inventory system. So the next time the technician looks at the inventory, oh, okay, the equipment is on the 2nd floor. Now, this for us, it updates every 24 hours. So I understand infusion pumps move around between then, but at least you have a good starting point to locate that equipment. And then continuously validating that equipment, and that is something that your IoT solution does for you without even really having to touch it. What you will need to look at is equipment that comes onto the network to make sure that you have it in your CMMS, right, that is inventoried. But that continuous discovery, that's something that IoT solution does automatically. And then for the manual data collection, first of all, if you're really set on doing this manually, you're going to have to hire someone. It's either an inventory management specialist, consultants. You can hire additional biomeds because it's a lot of overhead, a lot of tracking, a lot of writing things down, right? Your biomed or your inventory management specialist is going to walk around the hospital room to room, look at every piece of equipment, track it, write it down probably on a notepad somewhere, go back to the desk, enter that data into the CMMS. By the time they're at their desk entering that data, who knows if the equipment was restarted and now has a new IP address or it's in a different location. But you're going to have to keep doing this over and over and over and over. And we all know this, right? We all know we have to update that, and it's just a very, very manual effort. So your 2 paths. So IoT solutions, a lot of organizations shy away from them because they say it's expensive to bring in an IoT solution. Well, path 2 is probably arguably more expensive in the long run. Did you want to add anything?
No.
Okay, all right. The second pillar, vulnerability management. And then as I mentioned earlier, we're going to discuss patch management really as a subsection of vulnerability management. Our main goal is to reduce the known vulnerabilities and maintain that clinical uptime. So how do we do that? Again, you have 2 paths here. So first of all, we have to identify what our vulnerabilities are. So you have your automated path, and then you have your manual tracking. For your automated path, your IoT solution looks at your equipment, looks at the assets, the models that you have out there, and then it matches them with the vulnerabilities that are fed automatically into your IoT solution. So they have sources all over the place. It all gets into that one system, and you're only now seeing the vulnerabilities that actually impact you. In a medical device security program, that is pure gold, because we could also, if we don't have an IoT solution, we would be spending hours, days, weeks probably reviewing just vulnerabilities from various sources that don't even impact us. So there's really no value there for you. Okay, prioritize the vulnerabilities. This is something that an IoT solution automatically does for you. It looks at the risk of the vulnerability, the scoring, and the exploitability of the vulnerability. You might have a vulnerability that's really high risk, but it's not exploited, okay? You might have a vulnerability that's medium risk, but it is exploited. So which one do you prioritize? And so that's something that IoT solution can also help you with. Then manually, you still have to coordinate that remediation with the vendor. What does that look like? What can you do to remediate that vulnerability? Many times it's patching, or it can be applying those compensating controls. And so 3 and 4 are very similar with the manual tracking of vulnerabilities. We'll get into that in just a second. But the one step that you do have that's an added bonus here is that you have that monitoring of the device behavior after the fact. So let's say we can't patch the device, we have to apply a compensating control. We have to segment it on the network. It is getting its own VLAN, and we're applying ACLs to the firewall, saying that this device cannot talk to anything else other than maybe the server that it needs to talk to. Okay, now we've done that. We feel good about what we did, but the device is not working. And so with an IoT solution, you can now monitor that behavior and see what could be going on that is preventing that device from functioning correctly. All right, manual process. like I mentioned, you're going to be out there spending a lot of time looking at CISA, you're going to look at vendor portals, you're going to be all over the place looking for those vulnerabilities. You know, you can make it a little bit easier on yourself if you talk to the vendors when you're doing the contracting and you're discussing what their vulnerability disclosure program looks like, right? Maybe if there's a vulnerability, they'll email you if you're lucky. A lot of times it's just really out there scouring the internet and communicating with your vendors to find if there's any vulnerabilities and how do they impact you. Then you can also perform vulnerability scans. I touched on those a little bit earlier. Vulnerability scans, something to keep in mind with medical devices. They're great. I'm a big fan of them. However, you need to make sure that it is in a highly controlled environment, meaning your piece of equipment is either in the incoming inspection phase or it is out for PM or CM. So no patient is using this piece of equipment, and there's a technician right there. That's how my team is handling all these vulnerability scans. We make sure that someone is physically in front of the device to make sure it's not in clinical use. And then you need to find a way to track all your vulnerabilities, right? It could be maybe in your CMS if it's robust enough. Maybe you're tracking them on a spreadsheet, but you're going to track your vulnerabilities against your device inventory. And then you're going to manually evaluate the risk of those vulnerabilities. So how do they score up against each other? Like I mentioned earlier, do you triage the medium vulnerability that's exploitable first, or do you work on the vulnerability that's a high risk but it's not exploitable? So just some things to keep in mind. And again, you coordinate that remediation effort and you patch the device or you apply a compensating control. If you're doing it manually, it's very difficult in a biomed setting to then monitor the device behavior because you're not networking. And in many cases, not IT, and you don't have access to those same resources. So monitoring that device behavior, very difficult after the fact.
Yep. Just to kind of put this in perspective, I know that if you're not in cybersecurity, it might seem a little overwhelming, but I don't know if anybody heard on the radio this morning that Canvas, a software that's used by the school system, 265 million is what I heard people have their information stolen. So it is a big deal, right? In that now you're not a trusted partner anymore. So do you think those people have confidence in their schools anymore if they can't keep their data safe, right? And so I think that's really a big deal. People choose where they get their healthcare from. And if you're not a trusted partner, you're probably not going to get chosen. So not that it can't happen to you, but if you're doing all this stuff in the background, you know, that people aren't seeing, but they're also not seeing, right? We're making it as safe as possible. So I just want to add that because it puts it into perspective of why we do what we do.
Yeah. And I'll tell you from a personal perspective, I had a baby at one of our hospitals last year. And when my baby was born, he decided that breathing just wasn't for him, okay? He just decided it's not something he was up for today. And so right away, he was rushed to the NICU. They took great care of him. I know our biomeds. I knew that I didn't have to worry about the equipment, right? And I know because we have a solid cyber program, I was confident too that the monitors that my kid was hooked up to were fine. So that's something most patients don't think about. They might look at the equipment and say, you know, it looks a little bit older or so, but maybe it's fine. Maybe you don't even think about it in those situations. But once you are thinking about vulnerabilities and you know what's out there, you also start thinking about how safe is your family member coming into this environment, you know, and it's not something that they're ever going to think about. So something to keep in mind. That's really why we're doing all this. That's why we're putting so much work into cybersecurity. All right, patch management. Lots of different options to choose from. You can go with vendor patching. So vendor patching, the vendor comes on site, patches your device for you. Hopefully they provide you documentation on the patches that were applied, and hopefully they're patching everything and not just some things, right? But it's going to be very hard for you to know what was patched unless you then run a vulnerability scan if you can. Manual patching, meaning you're going to the device and you're deploying that patch to the system. Again, it's going to be very difficult to know what patch is needed for this system if you're doing it manually. unless you're just patching on a monthly basis, whatever comes out as far as updates, you apply those patches, but that's an option for you. Semi-automated patching. So semi-automated patching for us is patching with a WSUS server. So what we do is we have our medical devices, Windows devices, we check them into a WSUS server. So they now communicate with the server. They say to the server, hey, I'm here. This is what's currently going on. This is my operating system. These are the patches that are installed on me right now. And then the server then says, okay, this is what I think you need, right? And at that point, our team validates with the manufacturer and says, are these patches approved to be installed? If so, we approve them on the server. And then the next time one of our vulnerability or patch management specialists goes to that device, they just hit the check for updates button, and everything that's approved can now install on the device. So it really makes it easier from a Biomed perspective, because you're not in front of the device trying to figure out what do I need to install to secure this device. It's going to be done on the server side, and it makes it a lot easier. The last option, automated patching. Sounds awesome, right? Automated, someone's going to do it all for us, but automated patching means IT is going to do it for us. Okay. All right, so let's score them. The worst idea. Okay, red, automated patching, please don't. A lot of times, automated patching requires an agent to be installed on the device. If we're talking SCCM, for example, or it now has a new fancy name, ME something or other, yeah, Tucker knows. Not a good idea, because again, the manufacturer will come back saying it was not validated with this agent installed. So please, if you can, don't, if it's approved by the manufacturer.
The second part to that is you don't know if there's a patient on the device. So at 2 a.m., here comes the patching, right? And that's at the most critical time. So we really frown on automated patching just because on the other end of that device, it's a critical time frame. So
yeah, vendor patching. Okay, we're looking at orange here, right? At least it's patched. Okay, make sure you get that documentation.
Very expensive,
yeah,
usually, and they do it on whenever they feel like it. So those two things are kind of a downside for vendor patching.
And make sure you have that documentation, right? So it can be audited. Manual patching, like I said, it's if you have a solid program in place and your environments are comfortable with patching devices, this is a good option for you. It's better than automated patching, and it's better than vendor patching, in my opinion. And then, of course, like my preference personally is that semi-automated patching, where HTM has control over the patches that are installed on the device, and we deploy the patches when we are in front of the device. So it's a full HTM controlled environment for patching. Risk management, arguably the most challenging area when it comes to medical device security. So our goal here is to identify the risk, classify the risk, and prioritize what that risk looks like. And of course, you want to make sure that there's no operational impact when it comes to some of these things. So again, I'm going to give you two options here. You have your automated path, and then you have your traditional path. And the traditional path includes building your own scoring model, or you perhaps take a scoring model that's already published. But with the IoT solution really identifies and classifies your risk for you. It looks at the device, it looks at the behavior on the network, it looks at the vulnerabilities, it looks at the operating system, everything that you can think of that can pose a risk, it looks at it and it classifies it for you. And then it assigns a risk score based on how that device is communicating and behaving on your network. And then it will update that risk score and that rating according to what's happening with that device as well. So it's not a static risk score. The device doesn't come in and has a risk of 3 and stay at 3 forever, or low, medium, normal, high. I don't know what order medium and normal go into, but those are typically kind of the risks that it will score it into. And then you can feed that information, if you have that bidirectional integration stood up that we discussed earlier, into your CMMS, CMDB, or even your SIEM for real-time visibility. And at that point, your information security department, your SOC can also see what's out there and react to those things. When we're looking at a traditional risk scoring model, click. first of all, you have to define your risk scoring model, like I mentioned, or you pick one up somewhere on the internet. There's a lot of data out there for risk scoring. And then you have to categorize your devices, and that's usually done as part of asset management, right? When a new model comes in, we look at what is the impact to the patient, the criticality to the device, and it gets classified. So those are two of the core components here. And then you evaluate that device against that risk scoring model that you created, and you have to track that. Again, CMMS, you can track your risk there, you can track it in your Excel spreadsheet. Somewhere you can track it on a piece of paper, but it has to be tracked. And you create a remediation plan. What do you prioritize and how do you do it? You manage and remediate your risk according to what you come up with. So, traditional risk scoring, what does that look like? And this looks a little bit scary, but this is what it looks like. This is what your risk scoring model will look like, right? We're looking at, you're basically asking two questions here. What is going to be the likelihood of something happening, and what will be the impact if it happens? Okay. So in our scenario, we're going to talk about a patient monitoring device that's running an outdated software with a known vulnerability that could allow unauthorized network access. Okay. So first, we're going to look at the likelihood score. How likely is this that this is going to happen, right? How likely is that this exploit will happen? 4. In this scenario, it's very likely that this will happen. So the score here would be a 4 for likelihood. Then we're going to assign that impact score. Impact score is 5, right? This, for the patient monitoring, there's so many things that could go wrong. So this will be 5. So next, we have to calculate what that risk score actually looks like. So we're going to say 4 times 5, we're going to do some quick math, 20. Okay, so extreme, right? So that is where your risk lies in this specific scenario. So now think about it. If you're doing this manual process, you are going to do this for every piece of equipment, for every model, every vulnerability that's out there. And we know we're not like IT. We don't just have 10 models, right? We might have 200 or how many models?
2,500.
Yeah, 2,500 models out there, right? We have a lot of different models, and you're going to be doing this for every piece of equipment, for every vulnerability. All right, now risk assessments for new medical devices. What does that look like? So first, information security will conduct a risk assessment. HTM should be involved in this risk assessment, right? You're really the SME when it comes to this equipment. You know how it functions. You need to be there to review that risk assessment, and you're going to provide a sign-off. It might not be an official sign-off. It might just be a SME sign-off, a soft sign-off. But before it goes to your CISO or the director of information security to officially sign off on that risk assessment, they're also looking for your input. They want to know, from a Biomed perspective, the people that are touching this equipment every day, is our assessment correct, right? We're evaluating this device based on what the vendor is telling us. But you guys are really the experts in saying that's not how it's deployed out here. So get involved in that process, and be the SME in that process, and provide that sign off. And then it goes back to information security. Once you've reviewed it, they will create a corrective action plan. So they will say, okay, we're looking at this piece of equipment and it's really not as secure as we would like it to be. So we're going to segment it on the network. So one of the items on the corrective action plan might be network segmentation. Move it on its own VLAN, deploy those ACLs, make sure that it cannot communicate to anything else other than, like I said earlier, perhaps that server that it needs to communicate with. So that corrective action plan is then created, and it's tracked, gets reviewed periodically. And then for HTM, especially in the cyber role, they then manage those CAPs, those corrective action plans, to ensure that they get implemented. And then we work with the clinical leaders to make sure that there's an ongoing operational process, right? And a lot of time when we think about imaging equipment, some of them just store pictures until they run out of space. And then we go in, right? So the machine is not working. I can't save anything. Okay, so then Biomed goes in, deletes all these records because they didn't need to be on there in the first place. They're already in PACS. There's no reason to keep them on there, right? But we're keeping all this patient information on these devices. in case a physician has questions and wants us to pull the study back up, more than likely that's not going to happen. So they can also look at PACS. So again, work with those clinical leaders to make sure there's an ongoing process in place to make sure that whatever you're saying needs to happen in those caps is actually implemented in the real world and it's followed through. So, oh, did I skip it? Okay, key inputs. This is important. Things that you should know or should have when you are looking at risk and looking at medical devices. MDS2. Hopefully you guys have heard about an MDS2. It stands for Manufacturer Disclosure Statement for Medical Device Security. This is a form that vendors should be providing to you about their equipment. It states the authentication limitations of the device. You know, can it be patched? Like all that information that we are discussing right here is found on that MDS2, right? If it tells you local patching is approved, that means that you can go to the device and you can install those patches on the device, right? There's a lot of information on there. You should have this for every piece of equipment. If the vendor tells you we don't have an MDS2, then we're not interested in doing business with you. Okay, it's easy as that. I mean, do you have that authority? No, probably not. But if you tell your CISO we're not interested in doing business with you, okay? That it should be a requirement for every healthcare organization purchasing medical equipment. Get us that MDS2. All right, vendor security architecture. They typically have a security white paper of some sort that they can give you. They might call it a white paper, an architecture document, but they have some kind of security document because everyone's asking for it. You also need to know what that clinical use is of that piece of equipment, right? Is it just a standalone unit that maybe it doesn't even need to be connected to the network, or does it need to be connected, and to what? So how is it going to be used in the clinical setting? Is it going to move from room to room? Or is it going to stay in one room? Do you have a multi-million-dollar robot that they decide we're going to wheel it around between operating rooms, right? Is it advisable? No, but does it happen? Yes. So what does that clinical use look like? And then network placement, of course. Where is it going to be on the network? And ask the vendor for a network diagram. What does that communication look like between, do they need to communicate to the vendor? Do they need to communicate internally? What systems do they communicate with? What servers? So do request that from the vendor as well. And then look at your own organizational security requirements. What does our organization require? What is the standard? And how does this device align with that or deviate from that? And then what are your regulatory requirements? Oh my gosh, we're about to run out of time. I'm in a hurry a little bit, okay? Network segmentation. So this is really difficult to achieve, and you only have one path here. So you can implement traditional VLANs, or you can look at micro-segmentation or zero trust. Zero trust is floated around out there a lot. It's very difficult to implement with medical devices unless you have a partner like an IoT solution, and it's a little bit easier. But really what your goal is to separate the clinical devices from your corporate network. And you want to definitely restrict east-west traffic and absolutely restrict that north-south. North-south is outside of your organization to your device, okay? And only allow what's necessary for communication. You don't want to have it wide open. We're going to restrict it to just the necessary ports and protocols. This right here, I threw it up there to give you an idea of what it can look like, but this is what traditional VLANing can look like, okay? You don't want to have all your medical devices in one VLAN. This right here, you have your lab devices in one, maybe surgery is in one, imaging is in one. Down there, you'll see you have legacy systems, okay? I don't want to see a Windows XP imaging device on the same network as your Windows 10 or Windows 11 devices. So keep that in mind. Infusion pumps absolutely should be separated. So create those VLANs, work with your networking team. Make sure if they're saying, okay, here are your VLANs, you need to now re-IP all your devices, right? So you need to, in most cases, get the vendor to come on site, re-IP your devices for you. So there's a cost associated with that. But make sure you also have those ACLs in place, okay? A VLANs like this, right? If you think of these like lanes on a highway, you're saying you can only drive in this one lane. But if I don't have an ACL in place, there's nothing preventing me from changing lanes, okay? I can still talk to other devices. So ACLs are a must. You gotta have those put in. Okay, if we're looking at identity-based segmentation, also known as zero trust, what we're looking for here is there's a tool that will then evaluate what is this device, right? It sees the device, it says, what are you? It might look at Active Directory, certs, it does device profiling, and then it assigns tags, security group tags. Based on that information, you guys have to define the role network, and we'll define those groups, you implement those groups, and that's another way. So that's really zero trust in a nutshell without going, we're gonna talk about it more after, I just gotta get through this. All right, change management. You're going to implement a controlled process of making changes to your medical devices that's auditable. So we have to be able to go back and see what happened to the device, and you know, just in case. So a lot of IT, I will say all IT shops will have a change advisory board, right? So the easiest thing for you to do, tie yourself into that change advisory board. Demand you have a voice in there. They're making network changes all day long. Who does it impact, you guys, right? You got to go out, figure out why did that take down my equipment? What's happening here? So tie yourself into that existing process, have a voice on that, and you know, when they say, oh, we're going to switch out this switch over here, you're going to say, okay, what equipment does that impact? They're going to say, oh, we're not sure. Here's a list of MAC addresses. Okay, great. So before we do that, let's figure out what equipment is actually impacted before we just say, yes, let's go ahead and do that, because it's never happened, right, Lynn? We've never had that.
Well, just to add one thing to that, so we now sit on our IT's change advisory board, but when I first got on it, they said something like, we use the screen method to categorize whether a change went well. And I was like, is that an acronym? I've never heard of that before. And it literally is, if work orders start coming in after the change, that's the screen method. And I was like, that can't be possible. So we get to kind of put our hand up now and say, like, if you don't know what's affected on the other end of this change, then we're going to hold on it until you can let us know that it's going to at least be 80% good. And then we'll vote and move it forward. So luckily, our IT team has really partnered with HTM and given us that voice to halt things, and we have in the past. But obviously, there's room for improvement too. So.
All right, so operational impact risk assessments, right? What is going to happen if this goes sideways? That should be part of your change process. So if I implement this change and it doesn't go as planned, is it going to wipe out all of Jen's telemetry back there? If it does, how fast can I get it back up? Okay, so that should be a part of an assessment as well. And then someone should peer review a change. So if you're making a change to anything, have someone check it, right? There's no hurt in that. Someone's going to just put another set of eyes on it, say, yeah, this looks good, or they're going to question you. And there's nothing wrong with that too. I mean, we're all human. So they might say, hey, have you considered this? So, you know, then after that, we're going to schedule the change. Ideally, you're going to do this during an approved maintenance window. You're not going to do it Friday night when everyone is not working. Okay, and we're going to document and track all the changes and make sure that we can audit those changes if we need to. All right, change management. So I'm going to just click through this, and you're welcome to take a picture of this slide, but we're really looking at what needs to be evaluated, who needs to be involved, you know, what's the impact, what do I need to document, and so on. So really HTM should be involved in any change. IT, information security, a clinical leader, all those people need to be notified if we're making a change to a system that's significant. And evaluate it, right? Patient safety impact, what does that impact if we're making that change? What is the impact if it goes sideways? And what does that downtime look like? How fast can we get it back up? Governance.
So I'll just do this really quick. So obviously we need partners, right? We do InfoSec, we have IT as our partner, and that we need to lean on each other, right? So it's like, if you think about it, like a 3-leg stool. If one goes away, you're tipping it over, and the clinicians are the ones that suffer. So we do have something similar to this setup in my organization, and the voices are heard. Let me put it that way. So I think that if you don't have that, this is probably almost your first starting point, right? Like, get the players at the table, and then you can start to make momentum. And then I'll just hit on this really quick. So making the vendors behave. Like that's a full-time job, right? So they're going to sell to the clinicians. They're going to tell you everything is safe. And so basically you have to be the voice of reason and say, that's great. It's safe. Put it in writing. We are you do patches, right? And my favorite example I won't use the vendor's name, but infusion pumps, right? So if you go 2.5 years and can't remediate a vulnerability, we might not want to do business with you in the future, right? Like you're struggling on your research and development. So really like having them, if you say, putting in writing what they say they're going to do. So no over promises unless you're going to put it in writing is basically the gist of that.
All right, and then what does good look like? Right, so you're approaching your medical device security program from a risk-based approach. You're looking at highest risk items first. You have strong collaboration between those teams. It will be your, like we mentioned before, your information security team. It will be just HTM technicians, the medical device security team, IT teams, networking, right? You really need to have that collaboration, otherwise it's not going to work for you, because everyone is a stakeholder in this, right? It's about patient safety and everyone really needs to come together. And then it's all about continuous visibility and improvement. Like we said earlier, you're going to start somewhere and you're going to build on that, right? Create that momentum and just one step at a time.
And
2 minutes. Oh, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, just to add to that, so there's another layer that I don't know if you guys know what high reliability organization is. They're starting to push that out there where, you know, you're making the best decision every single time for the patient. And there's also business continuity. So it was kind of a little bit of a shock when somebody came to me and said like, well, if we lose all our connectivity, what devices can we still use and how do we still use them? Well, that's a little bit of deer in the headlights, right? Because you don't know until you start experiencing that. So that's also part of the cyber program. How do we continue operations when we have unforeseen things happen, right? And then what can we still do? Can we still scan on a CT? And then where are we going to store that? Is it go on a thumb drive? What do we do with that, right? And so I think that's part of, as we evolve, right, as Biomed and HTM, they're leaning on us a lot harder for this. And it's just kind of, it comes with the nature of the game. So that's all I want to say.
Questions?